must have been Monday, I think it was, that had all the handouts. We're not doing handouts for this class, primarily because most of what we're going to be doing is in the Bible. And you don't need a handout if it's in the Bible. You need a Bible. What I did send was what our PowerPoint is going to be. We're going to have a few slides. There's not a number. There's a few of them, not a whole lot. But in that email are the slides. If you want to print them out and carry them with you, you're more than welcome to do so. Otherwise, we aren't going to have what I'd call kind of canned notes like we have in the past. So with that, let's talk about what the intent of this, the goal of this class. And it basically has to do with to discover and apply what Paul had to say in his epistles to today's life and today's church. That's our goal. You might recall as we were going through the session on culture and the Christian, we went through a number of different biblical references, and we talked about the Bible really has much to say about everything in today's life. The Bible, one of the advantages of the Bible is it is timeless. You can take principles that were taught 2,000 years ago, you can apply them today. That's what we're going to attempt to do over the next few months, and we're going to look at 4 specific books. Now, when I say the Pauline corpus, we picked 4. I picked 4 of the books. Actually, you picked them the last time we talked about what you would like to study. These are the 4 books that came up: Ephesians, Galatians, Colossians, and Philippians. They're not quite in order in terms of when they were written, but probably in order of the message. So those are the books that we're going to look at out of the Pauline corpus to see what Paul has to say to the church today. To do that, I wanted to do this kind of opening session to do 3 things. First of all, a little review of basics of interpretation of the Bible. Those of you who are in the class before on how to read the Bible for all it's worth, this will be a little bit of a review for you. If you weren't here before, there'll be some new news, but it's basically when you read the Bible, how to go about pulling out, exegeting what it is the writer had to say. So that's the first thing we're going to do. Here's the second thing. This is called the Pauline corpus. So the question is, why Paul? Why is it Paul instead of somebody else? So we'll spend a little bit of time on why Paul and how he was the ideal choice for his job. And then thirdly, a section I'm calling Setting the Stage, when we're going to set the stage kind of historically and geographically for all of Paul's works, talk about and most people will call it 4 missionary trips. Typically there are 3 and then the trip to Rome. So we'll look at a little bit of that in setting the stage and a little bit about how all of these came about. So that's what's going to happen today, is the overview. I doubt that we'll get to the introduction to Ephesians. If we do, we'll get there. If not, we'll pick it up next week, the introduction, and start in chapter 1. So let's start, first of all, some of the basics of interpretation. And as I said, if you were here in our session on how the Bible became the Bible, you'll recall this handy, I found a new chart that's got colors and everything, so I thought you would enjoy this one better. You'll recall our chart on the principalizing bridge. So we're going to spend some time with that because that's basically how we're going to exegete, how we're going to pull out what Paul has to say then and apply it to what he's saying now. Did I? Actually, that's what I thought too, but I typed it both ways. And it came up this way.
Well, they're not consistent.
No, it's misspelled.
Yep.
It's spelled right on the bridge. Just has an I missing.
Just has a minus.
Pardon? Okay, fine. I've spelled it both ways. I'm telling you that if you either spell it either way, one of the good things about Word is it says you've misspelled this. It misspells it both ways. So now we have both ways. We can pick which one we want. The ayes have it. Sorry, Ernie. Well, you think, though, I'd at least be consistent in my misspelling, though, wouldn't you? Okay, so first of all, we're going to get to the single most basic piece of biblical interpretation. I'll ask you what that is, and we'll see how many of you remember this. But I want you to recall this. First of all, no book in the Bible was ever written to you. That probably goes against everything that every preacher's ever told you, that the book of such and such was written to you. It was not. No book of the Bible was ever written to you. Every book of the Bible was written for you. So the distinction is there was an original audience, there was an original hearer, an original group to which the message was given, but that group is exactly the same way we are today with some differences in culture. So the first thing to remember is none of these books were written to you, but all of them were written for you. Now here's the question. If I asked you what is the single most important thing in biblical interpretation, your answer would be?
My opinion.
And in your case, that's a true statement.
What does the Bible say? What does Scripture say?
Anybody else? Context, 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 context. The issue is always in the Bible is always the context. Once we know the context, we know what was being said, and the context that was being said, and how to apply it. So, I want to make just a couple of points before we get into the bridge. And the first one is this. To understand the Bible from the perspective of the original writer, it's important to do a couple of things. First of all, to recognize each of us has a preconceived notion and a particular point of view that color how we look at everything, certainly color our interpretation. So when we are reading the Bible, we need to be aware of those things and how they affected the original readers and how they are affecting us. Let me give you some examples of this. First of all, let's ignore the different languages in the country. Let's just deal with English and the differences in English. I think I may have told you the story before that years ago, Deborah and I went to New Orleans. We just happened to be there for Mardi Gras. I had no idea what those people were saying. Relatively certain it was in English, but the dialect is very different. That's true of us today. Let me give you a few examples. What do you call the last meal of the day? Dinner? Supper? Dinner? Supper? Yep, depending on where you're from, it'll be dinner or supper. How about another one? If you go out and get something to drink at Sonic, what do you say? I'm going to go get a Coke. I'm going to go get a Pop. I'm going to go get a soft drink, right? Or how about just in culture? Let me give you another one. This happens to Deborah quite a bit. Deborah was born in southeast New Mexico but grew up in Odessa. And whenever she gets around anybody from Texas, suddenly her kind of southern drawl comes back. And instead of saying, what would you like to do, it becomes, what y'all like to do, right? So those are just some examples of just language differences. Well, what about the culture itself? And I think I've told this story before as well. You know that I spent my junior high and senior high years in Shiprock on the reservation. And now in the Navajo culture, if you meet someone, you do not shake their hand. You hold it for a very short period of time if you're just meeting them for the first time. If it's somebody that you've known for a long time but haven't seen for a long time, it's the same thing. I've known Ernie for years and years and years. If I went up to Ernie today, I would not shake it in the Navajo Nation. I would not shake his hand. I would hold his hand for and it can be a long period of time. That's the culture, an idea of how the culture works. Let me give you another one. How about distance? You know, in New York, you might say, well, it's a 4-hour trip. Well, in New York, that might be 75 miles. Here, you can get 300, depending on who's driving, you can get 300 miles. Or how about just, and I usually say California, but now it's gotten to the point where it's more related to big city stuff. California kind of lives by the automobile. It tends to personify, to give personal characteristics to its highways. Instead of saying, well, I'm going to take Interstate 10, it becomes, I'm taking the 10. Whereas out here, it's kind of like, well, after you cross Baker's Bridge, right? So those are some differences in culture. That's the first thing to remember. The second thing is this. It's important to remember that every book of the Bible, as I said earlier, was written to a specific audience with a specific message to convey. We do not create the meaning out of text. Rather, we seek to find the meaning which is already there. That is called exegesis. That is extracting what the meaning was from the word. You want to be an exegete. You do not want to be something called an eisegete. An eisegete is what Lynn does. Kidding, obviously. An eisegete is reading into what it is you want the Bible to say. Eisegete? Yeah. It's E-I-S-O-G-E-S-I-S. Eisegesis. Exegesis is just the opposite. E-X-E-G-E-S-I-S. Now, let's talk about the method of how you do that using the principalizing bridge. I will point out one slight difference here from our last one. In our last one, we only had 4 steps. This one added a fifth step. And the 4th step is the one that got added, consult the biblical map. Doesn't really make any difference. We're going to end up at the same place, which is, first of all, grasp the text. You'll notice on the kind of left-hand side as you face, the left-hand side of the river, we have their town. Their town meaning what was going on in the culture at the time it was written, and who are the people it was written to. Then we have the bridge over the river, over which we're going to talk about these things like how does culture and language and time and situation and even the covenant that you are under. How do those affect what was being talked about then and what's being talked about now? And then third, crossing the bridge, how do we find the pieces that are applicable to both? So, and apply them to us. So let's talk first about the grasping, the text in their town. And I will tell you that we are not going to read, when we get into Ephesians and the rest of them, we are not going to read all the verses in that whatever passage we're studying at the time. I'm going to pick and choose the ones that are important for us. So I would suggest the week before you read whatever it is we're going to look at. And it's likely we're going to be a chapter a week or something like that. Read it, then read it again, then read it again. Scrutinize the text. Quite a few of you were here when we did How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. And you'll recall there were some keys to look for, one of which is repetition. If you see repetition in the passage you're reading, if you see the word holy, 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 you know that biblical writer is trying to make a point about something specific in that passage. So look for what the text has to say. In terms of overall understanding of what's called the pericope, and that's a section of doesn't necessarily have to be a complete chapter, can be a part of the chapter. In terms of the pericope, look back at the passage before and forward to the next passage to come. Because many times, especially when you read Paul, and if in Paul's writings, when you see therefore, go find out what therefore is there for, because he uses it more than anybody else. That means you have to go back and see what it was he was talking about to say now, therefore. And then finally, synthesize the passage in 1 or 2 sentences, and rarely in fact I don't do this a lot, rarely will people do this, 1 or 2 sentences, write out what the passage meant to the biblical audience. I don't care about you at this point. Well, that wasn't right to say, was it? I do care about you, but in terms of interpretation, we're not in the picture yet. We want to know what it was that was being said in their town. Then second, measure the difference between then and now. Look for significant differences between the original audience and the situation today. Let me give you an example. Food laws. Food laws, well, first of all, food laws don't apply to anybody in this room unless you are a Jew by religion and by blood, because the food laws applied to the Mosaic covenant or the covenant of the Sinai. You are not under the covenant of the Sinai. Another difference would be look for different covenants. What covenant was the original hearers under? What covenant are you under? So those are some differences, and then look for significant differences in situations between then and now. Let me give you one of the two probably most important differences between then and now. The first one is communication. Look at our communication today, and we talked about that in our culture in the Christian class. You can have, if Cecilia sent me an email, I could read it right now, that fast. Certainly didn't happen in the biblical writer's time, or the distances in travel. And we talked a little bit about this as well. We talked about a book and a concept called the 6 degrees of separation. And the book basically outlined that in any situation, if you got together in a room, say a room of this size, eventually 6 people would come together, and 2 of those 6 people would find something that they had in common. Well, we moved here from Biloxi, Mississippi. Well, really? I have an uncle who lives in Biloxi, Mississippi. Really? What's his name? Mike Schmidt. Oh, Mike Schmidt's kid played softball with Mike. The point is, that would not have happened even 100 years ago. That's how much smaller the world has gotten. So when you look for significant differences between the situations, look for things like differences in communication, differences in distance and time and other things. Then we're ready to cross the bridge to determine the theological principles. So there we want to recall the differences identified in the steps we just took, and then try to define similarities. So after reviewing the differences and similarities, we can return to the meaning for the biblical audience that we described in step 1, and try to identify the broader context that's going to apply to us. And one of the best places to do this, I'm going to spend very little time on it, is this. If we went to Ephesians 6 right now, especially the last half of Ephesians 6, and all of you have heard sermons on the full armor of God. You've probably heard them ad infinitum, because everybody does a sermon on the full armor of God. Everything that you read that Paul said to the Ephesians on the full armor of God applies directly to today. That's probably one of the best examples, and I'll show you what I'm talking about here. So the criteria for knowing what those are, and there are 5 of them. First of all, the principle, whatever this principle is, should be reflected in the text. In other words, if we're going to talk about the full armor of God, it should be reflected. It is in the text. Secondly, the principle should be timeless and not tied to a specific situation. You might remember in Numbers 25. Does anybody remember the zeal of Phineas in Numbers 25? In Numbers 25, we're getting dangerously close to Moses entering I started to say Moses entering the promised land. Moses will never enter the promised land, but Israel will. They're on the border. And what's happened is Israel has already fallen into apostasy by sexual issues, intermarrying, things like that. And you might recall that Moses does a bit of a speech on it, and the next thing you know, Phineas goes into a tent and he kind of skewers an Israelite, and it may have been a Moabite woman, I don't recall, but it was about the zeal of Phineas. Well, that's a specific instance tied to a specific period of time. Probably would not apply to, well, I would hope it would not apply to us today. So that's the second thing. The third thing is the principle should not be culturally bound, and you'll get a better understanding of this as we go through it. And fourthly, the principle should correspond to the teaching of Scripture. Finally, the principle should be relevant to both the biblical and contemporary audience. That's probably a lot more work that you're going to do when you're looking for how does the Bible apply to us today. But those principles in the back of your mind will help you. And if you would like, I can send these out in the email. You got them before when we did the session on how to read the Bible for all it's worth. Finally, apply the principles in our town. How should the individual Christian apply theological principles in their lives? And the steps would be, what did it mean to the original audience? 2, what are the differences? 3, what's the theological principle in the text? And 4, how does it apply to me today? That's a fairly simple process. We're going to do a little bit of an exercise on that when we get to Ephesians 6. Because Ephesians 6 and the full armor of God is probably one of the easiest ones to do, to say what was Paul saying and why was he saying it to the Ephesians at the time. By the way, when are we going to see the Ephesian church again in the Bible? Do you remember? Revelation. 40 years, 50 years, 40 years, somewhere between 40 and 50 years later, John's going to come back to the church, and one of the 7 churches is the church at Ephesus. And what's he going to say to them? Do you remember your first love? He's talking about this time. He's talking about what Paul was talking about to the Ephesian churches. So that's kind of a big picture view of how to interpret what we're going to be looking at and how to apply it. And as we go through each of these books, we're going to pull out some of those sections to see how they apply to today as we go through each of the 4 books. That was the first thing I wanted to talk about in terms of our review. The second thing I wanted to talk about is, you'll recall in our session on how to read the Bible, one of the first things we want to do is try to figure out what genre the book is written in. And the reason for that is, once you know the genre, you automatically know there's some specific things to look for. Let me give you an example. And genre is just a fancy word for types or similarities. Let me give you a couple of examples of genre. If you were to go to the sports section, I started to say if you were to go to the sports section of a newspaper, you would think you're going to read about sports, right? Well, unfortunately, I also read a whole lot about politics in today's sports section, but you'll get, maybe a better one would be if you went to the funny pages, which is also a genre. And also has politics in it. The point would be, you would expect to find certain things in each of those specific to that genre. As an example, in sports, you would expect to find scores maybe. And in comics, you'd expect it, well, a lot of times they aren't quite as funny as you think they are. There's some good ones. They're not any good ones as long as they took Dilbert out. That was my favorite. So you'd expect to find certain things. The same thing is true of the Bible. Once you know the genre of what it is you're looking at, it's going to automatically indicate to you some things to look for, as an example. And these are the genre of the Bible. There's a number of ways to divide genre in the Bible. You could divide it by all that's poetry. You could divide it by all that's prose. But typically the genres of the Bible are done in the kind of organization you see here. And I want to hit a couple of the high points here. They are, for the most part, chronological. In that, we go from Genesis to Revelation. So, for the most part, they are chronological, but that is not the theme. That's not the central theme of the Bible. The central theme of the Bible is thematic. In other words, what is the theme of that book? Let me give you an example of that. Some of you have probably read 1st and 2nd Kings, and then you turn the page and you start in Chronicles. And you think, man, didn't I just read a bunch of this stuff back in Kings? Well, yes and no. Here's the difference. 1st and 2nd Kings, written probably between 1000 BC and let's call it 600 BC, before the fall of Jerusalem. That's the time it was written. The books of 1st and 2nd Kings were written. 1st and 2nd Chronicles are a retrospective looking back at the same period of time. 1st and 2nd Chronicles are written, let's call it 450 or so. They're after exile. They're after the fall of Jerusalem, and Babylon has carried Israel into captivity. So now we're taking a view, looking back over the period, that same period of time. So in that case, they aren't necessarily chronological, but what are they? They are thematic. And you'll find some differences between the two books. But I would suspect that most of you, if you've read through the Bible, you've gone to 2 Kings, and then you turn the page and you're in 1 Chronicles, and you kind of go, didn't we already do this back here? Well, now you know why. It's by theme, and in this case, it's the theme as they occurred, the occurrences of 1 and 2 Kings, and then it's the theme in retrospect. Ezra and the other writers looking back saying, probably mostly Ezra, by the way, looking back and saying, well, what really happened in this period of time? That's a pretty good example of theme. There's also a misconception on a couple of things on the prophets, and that is this. Minor prophets just didn't have a very compelling message. That's not the issue at all. The reason they're divided into major prophets and minor prophets simply has to do with the length and the length of the message. The minor prophets primarily a lot smaller. In fact, if you get through the major prophets, you've read a major portion of the Old Testament. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. If you read through those major prophets, the ones that you'll see listed here, you're going to find a big portion of the Old Testament prophecy is covered. That doesn't mean, in fact, I would make the case that the minor prophets have significant contributions to make. As an example, Micah and the birth of Christ. The minor prophets have just as much to say. They're just considered a shorter book. That's the only reason there's a division in the prophets. And originally there was not. Originally, in the original Tanakh, there was no differentiation between major and minor prophets. They were just listed. The other thing that I wanted to point out was this. Acts, the book of Acts, is the only book that's categorized as a historical book by genre in the New Testament. That's critical because without Acts, think about this for just a minute. You get to the end of John. Acts isn't there. You go immediately to Paul's writings. You go immediately to Romans. You're going to go, man, where am I here? What fills in the blanks? Acts is what fills in the blanks. And Acts, it plays a major role in the epistles that we're going to be looking at. So Acts is the only what's called historical book in the New Testament. Without Acts, you would not have a clue what transpired.
The authorship, is it Luke?
Most believe it is Luke. And the reason for that is, and you won't find in the Gospels, you won't find Luke saying, this is the Gospel of Luke. What you do find is commonalities. And for the most part, everyone has said Luke and Acts were written by Luke, primarily because of two things. One, if you go look at the introduction to both of them, he says, my dear Theophilus, I write this, and he's talking about the gospel. Then you go look at the introduction to Acts, and he says, dear Theophilus, as I told you in my previous writings. So whoever's doing it is the same guy writing it. The primary reason that most people attribute both Luke and Acts to Luke is what are called the we passages. And in the we passages that you'll find in Acts, the we passages are Paul and I and Silas and somebody else did this. So the we passages indicates that it's Luke. And then finally, Paul calls him the good Dr. Luke. So you'll still get people say Luke didn't write it, but anybody who the evidence does, and anybody who knows what they're talking about will say that.
The other thing too is in the Conference of Trent, is it the Catholic Church determined the books and so forth to be inspired by God? There's also several books in the New Testament, right? The Catholic Bible has. Obviously, it's not listed in Protestant.
Yeah, in the Old Testament. There are none in the New Testament. There are some changes in the New Testament, but fairly minor. Ernie's question was, in the Catholic Bible, and when we talked about the development of the Bible, we talked a little bit about something called the Septuagint. The Septuagint was written about 208, most people call it 200 to 250 BC. And the reason it was written, Ernie, was by this time the Greeks had overwhelmed the world. So in Egypt, and this was in Alexandria, the Jewish rabbis realized, you know what? Our young people can't even read Hebrew anymore. So we need to do a translation from Hebrew into Greek. When they did that, and it's called the Septuagint because the tradition is 70 Jewish scholars in 70 days translated the Old Testament. Well, it couldn't have happened because some of the Old Testament is written after they did it, and their books were. So most people will say they did the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, but subsequently the remaining books were written. When the Septuagint were written, there were 15 additional books added. That's called the Apocrypha. In the Catholic Bible, not just the Catholic Bible, you'll find them in all the Orthodox Bibles, other Bibles. You'll find at least 7 of the books. Some of them have been combined, and that's called the Apocrypha. But that's all in the Old Testament. There are no New Testament apocryphal books.
But doesn't the Catholic Bible have some additional books that people can find here?
Yes, that's what I just said. They do.
No, in the New Testament.
Not in the New Testament. They have the same.
Jude? Well, Jude is there.
Jude's here.
There's another one.
Okay, here's Ernie's homework assignment. Ernie's homework assignment is to come back, well, let's see, it'll be, next week, to find what New Testament apocryphal books there are, and further, to give a theological treatise on them.
In 5 minutes.
Let's not get carried away.
Let me hit one other issue here on genre. You'll notice that genre, we have Paul's corpus, which include both his writings and also what are called his pastoral letters. And the pastoral letters were designed primarily to bring his young protégés along, with the exception of Philemon. Philemon's kind of a strange one, to bring his young protégés along in terms of what's going to happen in the church after he leaves. But I want you to look at the last category, and that's letters by others. Those are called the general epistles. I would not put Revelation, it is an epistle, I would not put Revelation in the category of letters or epistles. I would put Revelation, and a lot of Bible teachers will do the same thing. They put Revelation in a category all by itself called apocalyptic literature. Now, it is truly an epistle. It is John saying, here's what I saw. But its nature is not just a letter, but it's also prophetic. It also talks about end times, so it's eschatological. So I would probably have pulled that out and put it out by itself and just call it apocalyptic literature. The point to all of this is we're going to deal with, now that we know what genre is, we're going to deal with one specific genre, not only one specific genre, but one specific writer. Now, I keep saying that it's the Pauline corpus. It is not the Pauline corpus. It's only 4 of his books. So there are a total of, I think, 13 of his books. So in the epistles, I just wanted to hit a couple of high points. And the first is this. 21 of the 27 New Testament books are letters, or what are referred to as epistles. That's about 35% of the entire New Testament. Paul's responsible for 13 of those, or about 23%. So almost a quarter of the entire New Testament is written by Paul. If you were to add in Acts, Acts is not written by Paul, but when people talk about and some of your Bibles may have at the beginning of the book, it may say the Acts of the Apostles. It is not the Acts of the Apostles, it's the Acts of 2 apostles for the most part, Peter in the first 9 chapters and Paul from that point on. So if we add Acts into what is describing Paul, it's going to be more like anywhere from 30 to probably 35% of the New Testament deals with Paul. Now, most of these are what are called situational or occasional. And what that means is they're written for a specific time, a specific place, to a specific audience. But a lot of, and especially the general epistles, have become what are called circular. There's not a movement, there's been a thought by theologians that while all of these epistles were addressed to certain churches and certain times, that ultimately they all became circular letters. What do I mean by a circular letter? That's where I may write a letter to Ernie, and Ernie thinks, this is such a good letter, that he sends it to Lynn, who sends it to Jeff, who sends it to Ian. So it becomes a circular letter. In other words, the principles apply to all of them. In Corinthians specifically, I always call Corinthians Paul's recalcitrant church. It was his difficult church to deal with. But even in Corinthians, when he's talking about the specifics, they are going to apply to all of them. So you might make the point that all of these letters, and for us they are certainly circular letters because they all apply to us. Now, the letters are typical of most of the letters. They start out, and at the beginning you're going to get a salutation, and almost all of them. John's letters is the one that come to mind that don't identify him as the writer. But most of them will say, Paul, to the church at, just like we would in a letter today, if you write a letter today. Then there will be a body, and then finally a closing. And that follows the same pattern, but often in the very opening, and I'll give you a good example of it here. Remember I was talking about the Corinthian churches? In the very opening, what we're going to find is why that letter came about. And in many instances, it had to do with the church querying Paul. In other words, asking him about this and this and this. Let me give you a perfect example. I'm going to take this from, I told you his recalcitrant church was Corinthians. So in 1 Corinthians, here's what it says in 1 Corinthians 1, 10 through 12. I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, in the name of Jesus Christ, that all of you agree with one another in what you say, and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be perfectly united in mind and thought. My brothers and sisters, some from Chloe's household, have informed me that there are quarrels among you. And that's the way he starts out the book, and then he deals with these quarrels. You can probably notice a couple things here. These are what he just got through saying is directly applicable to today's church as well, isn't it? Agree with one another, be united. That's the first thing. You know what else is applicable to today's church? There's a busybody. Did you notice? Now, I don't want to call Chloe a busybody because basically she was saying, Paul, we have some problems in the church. This is what we need. So when you start reading many of the letters of Paul, Paul's actually addressing issues and questions that came up in that specific church that are going to be applicable to all churches. And we'll see that as we read through our 4 or so here. So that gives us a kind of an overview of the genre, gives us kind of an overview of how to interpret. Let's move on to the second major piece of this, and that is why Paul? Why would, and Deborah answered the question last night pretty simply. She said, because God chose him. I can't argue with that, but I want to give you 5 reasons why Paul was the ideal candidate. That doesn't mean there weren't others, but he was chosen. Why he was the ideal candidate to take the message to the Gentiles, to write the books that we're looking at. Why was he the ideal candidate? And the first one is this. Hebrew of the Hebrews. In Philippians, let me tell you what Paul says. By the way, the context in Philippians. In the Philippian church, there had been other, what were purported to be teachers, come into Philippi. And they attempted to denigrate Paul's efforts. They attempted to say, well, you know, he didn't get his master's in theology from Fort Lewis. He didn't do this. And so, yeah, well, you can't get one there for one thing, can you?
Did you send in your resume?
No, but I did look up, and I'm going to. I did look up. They have a specific method for adjunct. So I'm going to send it in.
Good.
Yep. I'll have to update it a little bit because it goes back to 1973. But so listen to what Paul says in Philippians to deal with this. If someone else thinks they have reasons to put confidence in the flesh, I have more, because they're talking about everything they've done for the gospel. He says this, and this is his list that you'll see in a number of other books too. Circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of the Hebrews, in regard to the law, a Pharisee. Now, as I said, the context here is he's going back to the church at Philippi and saying, wait just a minute, remember everything we talked about? I'm going to reiterate that for you, and I want to point out that this is coming from an apostle. So let me hit just a few points that he does in just this passage. First of all, he says Hebrew. The first time that word is used goes all the way back to Abraham in Genesis 14:13. And the context is an escapee coming from Sodom and Gomorrah comes to Abraham to tell him what's happened to Lot. And in the text it says, Abraham the Hebrew. That's the first time Hebrew is used in the Bible. Now, why would that be of import to those at the Philippian church? If there were any in the Philippian church, and there were some, that were Jews, they're immediately going to recognize when he says Hebrew, he can trace himself all the way back to Father Abraham. Here's the second point. He says, I'm from the tribe of Benjamin. That's another key to anybody who would have been in the Jewish church. If you're from the tribe of Benjamin, that meant that you are from the tribe of the very first king of the nation of Israel, Saul. Next to Judah, Ephraim, Benjamin is one of the most prominent tribes. In fact, when the kingdoms divide, north and south, most of the Benjamites go with Judah, not with the northern kingdom. Many join Judah in the southern kingdom, as I point out. So first of all, he says, I'm a Hebrew. I can go all the way back to Abraham. Secondly, I'm in the tribe of Benjamin. I can go all the way back to Saul. And then he does this. Thirdly, I'm a Pharisee. If you don't think I know what I'm talking about, you need to know what about the tribe of the Pharisees. One of the things that the Pharisees were known for was their zealousness for the law. They believed in resurrection. They also had an oral tradition. While a fairly small group, most people think there were less than 6,000 Pharisees in all of Israel, fairly small group, they really ordered what was going on in all of Judaism throughout the world. So now Paul has said, okay guys, you want to look at credentials? Let's look at them. I'm a Hebrew. I'm from the tribe of Benjamin. I'm a Pharisee. What more do you need to know about my knowledge about what occurred in the Old Testament? What more do you need to know when I say to you, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob talked about the coming of the Messiah. He came, you hung him on a tree. Pretty well establishes credentials, don't you think? Let me give you the second reason. Studied at the knee of Gamaliel. Some of you will say Gamaliel, you can pronounce it either way. Interestingly enough, Gamaliel is only mentioned in the New Testament twice. Never mentioned in the Old Testament. Mentioned twice in the New Testament. I'm going to give you a couple of citations here. But the place that Paul is referring to is in Acts 22:3, when Paul says he was raised at the knee of Gamaliel. What does that mean? Paul studied under one of the most prominent rabbis in the known world at the time, and that was Gamaliel. So he was the grandson of a rabbi called Hillel, and in Jesus' time there were two major schools of Hebrew schools or rabbi schools. One was Hillel, the other was Shammai. Hillel was by far the most prominent of the bunch. So he's in one of the two most important schools. Gamaliel is one of only 7 rabbis to be given the title of Rabban, which is an exalted title for teacher or master. Now, let me read to you a little bit more about Gamaliel. And if you are in Acts chapter 5, you might recall this. In Acts chapter 5, the context is that the Sanhedrin is trying to decide the apostles' fate after the church begins to grow. In Acts chapter 5, here's what happens. Peter and John and the rest of the apostles are actually in the temple precincts preaching the Messiah. So the jail guards go down and say, wait, you can't do that. Or the temple guards say, wait, you can't go do that. And they put them in prison. Do you recall that? So the next day, and the reason they do that is because nightfall was coming. The Sanhedrin was prohibited from meeting during nighttime hours. They had to meet during daylight hours. So the next day, they come to meet to decide what to do with these guys. And they say, go get them out of jail. They go to get them out of jail. And where are they?
Gone.
They're gone. You know where they are? They're back in the temple precincts preaching. So now the Sanhedrin is meeting, saying, what are we going to do with these guys? And they call them all in, and they're giving them the wherefore. And listen to what it says in Acts 5:34 through 35, and then 38 through 39. But a Pharisee named Gamaliel, a teacher of the law, who was honored by all the people, stood up in the Sanhedrin and ordered that the men be put outside for a little while. Then he addressed the Sanhedrin. Men of Israel, consider carefully what you intend to do to these men. And then he gives kind of a view of what's happened to others who have done that in the past. And he said, eventually they either died or their movement went away and nothing really happened with them. And listen to what he says at the very end of this. I want you to understand this is coming from the most prominent rabbi in all of Israel at the time. He says, therefore, in the present case, I advise you, leave these men alone. Let them go. For if their purpose or activity is of human origin, it will fail. But if it is from God, you will not be able to stop these men. You will only find yourselves fighting against God. That's Gamaliel, who basically makes the case for Christendom. So, what does that mean? Well, Paul is never called rabbi, but he would have been known in the he would have known the Old Testament inside and outside. He may have become Christian before achieving the status of rabbi. The point is, he's got the credentials now, and when we look at each one of these, with the exception of Philippi, when we look at each one of these churches, what's the first thing Paul's going to do? He's going to go into the synagogue. Why is he going to go into the synagogue? He's got the credentials to get him into the synagogue where he's going to be able to preach. That's when he's going to give the message, here's what the fathers said, here's what happened. The third item is Roman citizen. First of all, how did Paul become a Roman citizen? Well, and Paul will tell you he was a Roman citizen by birth, from Tarsus. There's a couple of possibilities. First of all, Emperor Pompey made Cilicia, which is the area that Tarsus is in the Old Testament. You can see Tarsus. You'll see Syria over here, and then Tarsus kind of on one of the routes here. So he's in Cilicia. Pompey made it a Roman province, and it later was given freedom from Augustus. One possibility was that the entire city of Tarsus was given their freedom, including the Jews. The second, and what many people believe is that Paul's father actually served either as a Roman soldier or served in the service of a Roman soldier and earned his citizenship. Well, again, so what? What does Roman citizenship have to do with? Well, let me read again from Acts 22. Acts 22, 25 to 29. Paul speaking to the crowd in Jerusalem after his third journey. He goes back to Jerusalem and he starts preaching again in Jerusalem, and the crowd the mob is ready to hang him. And here's what he says. As they stretched him out to fly, the Roman soldiers come and they take Paul, and they think he's inciting a riot. So they take him, and here's what happens. As they stretch him out to flog him, Paul said to the centurion standing there, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty?" When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and reported it. "What are you going to do? This man is a Roman citizen." The commander went to Paul and asked, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" "Yes, I am," he answered. Then the commander said, "I had to pay a lot of money for my citizenship." Paul says, "But I was born a citizen." Those who were about to interrogate him withdrew immediately, and the commander himself was alarmed when he realized that he had put Paul, a Roman citizen, in chains. Well, again, so what? Well, Roman citizens had a number of rights that other citizens did not. And one of the rights was you had to have trial. If he'd been just a regular Jew, wouldn't have been any question. They'd have just beat him to death. But they had a Roman citizen had rights. First of all, I want you to listen to this. They had the freedom to move about the Roman Empire unfettered. Secondly, they had the freedom to have open discussions. And thirdly, and probably most important, they had the freedom to appeal to Caesar. I want you to think about that for just a minute. A Roman citizen could go wherever he went. He could go to a court fine and he could appeal to Caesar. He could say, I want to go to Caesar for my judgment. Well, put all those three things together. First of all, they had the freedom to move about. Secondly, they had the freedom to have open discussion. Thirdly, they had the freedom to appeal to Caesar. So what did all those things mean? Not only could they go into the synagogue, but once they were finished with the synagogue, which usually happened, they went out into the highways and byways and preached the message there. Paul did, anyhow. And he could because he was a Roman citizen. Now, the last and most important was the appeal to Caesar. Paul's ultimate purpose was always to be in Rome. It was always to preach the gospel in Rome ultimately. That's where he wanted to be. And think about that for just a minute. If you go back to when Festus and Agrippa meet and they kind of interview him, and both of them, Festus representing the civil government, Agrippa representing the ecclesiastical government, both of them walk away saying, you know what, if he hadn't appealed to Caesar, we should have let him go. Paul wants to be in Rome. Paul wants to preach the gospel in Rome where the seat is. So that's why the Roman citizenship is important. Finally, I guess not finally, he was a witness to Christ's ministry. Now, we're not told in the Bible about how much Paul knew about Jesus, but we do know this. All the gospel writers record that Jesus is in Jerusalem. Why is that important? And John specifically tells us this, that Jesus was in Jerusalem for at least 3 Passovers. Well, Passover was called a pilgrim's feast. There was a requirement in the law that at any one of the 3 pilgrim's feasts during the year, as a Jew, you were required to be there. That means Paul had to have been there when Jesus was there. How much interaction he had with him, I can't tell you. But I can tell you this, he was at the stoning of Stephen. And he knew what that was about. And probably the best of the indicators about how well he knew Jesus, the Damascus Road experience. There's not a single apostle that was chosen specifically at one time, at one point, in such a dramatic fashion. Take all the rest of them. Peter, James, John, all of them were in a group of some type. It's Paul and Paul alone who's chosen as the single apostle and giving a specific task, which is to preach to the Gentiles. Finally, the final was he persecuted the early church. Now, why would that be an issue? Well, the first thing is he's going to have immediate credibility with Jews. The minute he walks into a synagogue, they're all going to say, ooh, that's Paul. They're going to listen to him. The second thing is that they notice that Christians begin to notice there's a real change in this man. In other words, they've seen what the gospel, the appearance of Jesus Christ, has done to him. They knew him originally as someone who would beat them. And now they're seeing a change in him that nothing can explain except the gospel message. And the third reason is this. Why is it important that he persecuted the early church? No one preaches like a convert. No. That's exactly right. If you find somebody that has recently said, Jesus Christ saved my life, that's one of the best preachers you're going to find. So those are the reasons, let's go back to the 5 reasons. Those are the reasons that Paul was the perfect choice for what we're going to see him do, not just in Acts, but in the books we're going to look at. Let's do this. Oh.
I'll wait. I'll read my question because I have to.
It'll be a homework assignment.
Yeah. No, Ernie, stop. It's my question. It's not yours to tell.
Well, actually, let's do stop. We haven't gotten yet. Lynn?
Do you have the slides or the pictures of the cities up in your computer there?
I do.
What about one of them, real quick?
Well, this was going to be later, but okay.
Oh, all right. What you're gonna do later, that's fine.
I don't have a lot. This is ancient Ephesus. This is, and I did this particular view. There's a number of views that you could get. I wanted you to see the detail. This is the Temple of Artemis, which later becomes the Temple of Diana. And this is in Ephesus, the Great Theater.
Yeah.
Those are, what was your,
Well, I just wanted to comment that Eileen and I were there a few years ago, and these places are just amazing. So if you have a chance to go, go. They're so much bigger than I thought they were.
we had somebody in our evening class that just got back from, it was called the Pauline Journey, I think. And they went to basically all of them. So I'd like to do that at some point.
Yeah, right. Same idea. Yes, yes.
We didn't get to setting the stage, but let's, because I know some of you have got to leave, let's stop there for today. And then we'll come back and just spend a little bit more time on setting the stage. We'll talk about some of these things, the missionary journeys, the recipients, the timelines, some of those things, and then get into Ephesians. So let's do that next week. Does that work for everybody? Let's see. John, it's so good to have you back. And to prove that no good turn goes unpunished, I'm kidding, it's not a punishment. Would you like to do a closing prayer for us?
Let my wife do it. She does a great job.
Okay, you start the prayer, you end the prayer, you two just go. Cecilia, why don't you close us?